All right, folks, welcome back. Sheepdog Smoke here as always. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Class Time. This one is not going to be as long as it's really setting up for the precursors to the Civil War. I mean, there's a lot that happened in the wake of the War of 1812. There's a lot that was going on right at the same time. And this would really be what sets the stage for the South to decide that the federal government was overreaching and ultimately spawned the Civil War. In the War of 1812, we had seen that Britain was really not ready to give up on the idea of colonies being under their rule, despite a win in the Revolutionary War for the colonists forming the United States. We saw the British sack the White House. We saw basically just that they were not willing to give up, and the War of 1812 really was the final straw that convinced them they're not going to regain the colonies. In the wake of the War of 1812, sorry, can't talk today. President Monroe saw that Europe was very, very interested in the Americas. Spain had lost its colony in Florida because they were basically told, you can either spend the time and manpower and money to police this entire territory, or you can just sell it to us. Ultimately, Spain sold the Florida territories they held to the U.S. for $5 million, as we discussed last time. What Monroe was seeing, though, was that that wasn't the end of it. Perhaps Spain was not looking at the United States, the North American areas, but they still had interests in the Americas. Mexico at the time was still a Spanish colony, and even though there were the rumblings of revolution, Monroe saw that this was going to keep Europe very close to the Americas. So this spawned the Monroe Doctrine. First, that there should be no European interference in U.S. affairs. Second, no new colonization of the Americas by Europe. And that any colonization attempts by European countries would be seen as an act of aggression. Now, Britain still held control over Canada. They still do to this day to some degree, as Britain still technically rules. There is only a Prime Minister of Canada, but Parliament still has a lot of, some sway. But that was already there, so that couldn't really be contested. But what we're going to see is in the late 1810s up to 1820, 1821, there were rumblings of revolution in Mexico. Simon Bolivar had been leading revolutions already at this point, and Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla ultimately in 1821 was part of the push that won independence for Mexico from Spain. Now, Prussia, Russia, and other European countries were wondering, should we aid Spain in their push to maintain or regain control over their territories? And ultimately it was the Monroe Doctrine and other things that kept them out of it. They knew it would be a cash drain to be sending troops or supplies or both or anything else to Spain to help them sail over an ocean to fight for that land, as opposed to possibly later setting up trade with them. There were a lot of things that were not grown or produced in Europe that could be grown and produced in the U.S. or in other parts of the world. We already had tea coming from India, spices coming from the Far East, cotton being grown, tobacco being grown in the U.S. So while it will take a while, Monroe taking such a strong stance as saying, if you attempt to colonize in the Americas, it will be seen as an act of aggression. And this from a tiny little nation that had defeated the British only 40 years previously, had to carry just a little bit of weight to tell these other countries they're serious about this. Right after this, though, we had another presidential election. 1824 would see Andrew Jackson elected as president. Now, Jacksonian democracy or Jacksonian Democrats, if anyone could argue that there was some sort of party switch, in my mind, it would only be what the very, very first iteration of the Democratic Party, which would be the Jacksonian Democrats, were. Jackson, I firmly believe today, would not be a Democrat. He would not support just a behemoth of a government, keeping everyone beholden to them for virtually everything. Now, Jackson was the one that pushed for expanding voting rights. At the time, only landowner white men could vote. In fact, in that election, none of the candidates, all of the candidates were actually of the same party. There was no way to pick one person per party. We were still very close to George Washington's time, where he advised against political parties. Jackson and his compatriots and his colleagues agreed with this. So you would see an election where you would have multiple people of the same party all running. As none of them received the preponderance of electoral college votes needed, this was actually decided by the House of Representatives, with Henry Clay as Speaker, who became Secretary of State. Now, this is what started kind of what happens today. Prior to this, you really didn't see a lot of presidents coming in and instantly replacing members of the cabinet, replacing members of the administration. With Jackson's appointment of Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, who led the House to elect him as president, as Secretary of State, this kind of brought in some sour grapes. Jackson, though, would argue that cleaning house was necessary, and I agree to a point. In the movie, just a few years ago, Walking Tall with The Rock, the remake, you see where he had won the election to be sheriff, and the outgoing sheriff says, "I can vouch for all these men, they're very good." He looks at them and says, "You're all fired." Quite literally saying, "I'm going to be the entire sheriff's office." That's not good. You can't walk into any job and say, everybody's fired. Especially a job like the presidency, where most of the positions that need to be there have to go through congressional approval. Your cabinet members, your Secretary of State, your Secretary of Treasury, your Secretary of Defense, all of these people have to be vetted by Congress, the oversight. But you can't just depend on someone who's been there for 4 years under a candidate that actively campaigned against you to work for you to the best of their ability. We're seeing this. We've seen it with Peter Strzok. We've seen it with James Comey and John Brennan. We've seen it with so many people where they worked to, one, rig the election in 2016, and then also to aid in the attempted coup d'etat since then. It would have likely been very close to the same. It would have been people not doing their best had Barack Obama been forced to keep George W. Bush's cabinet. Had George W. Bush been forced to keep Bill Clinton's cabinet, it would have been the same. These would have been people that were not of the same line of thought. They didn't think and act and work and believe the same as the commander-in-chief. So there is a need for some house cleaning. I mean, there are other positions that don't need to do this. You can look at many of them, from the housekeeping staff to the groundskeeping staff to the Secret Service, to the Marine Guards, to the kitchen staff, to the curator of the museum portions of the White House. Those people are not political appointees. They're not political jobs. The switchboard operators, they're not political jobs. You need certain jobs, and this is what Jackson was arguing, that would have some sense of fraternity with the office of president. And I'm not going to say loyalty, because you're not supposed to be loyal to a president. You're loyal to your country. But when you have a bias against the person now in that office, that is going to influence you in ways it should not. And this is what Jackson was arguing. He was arguing that he needed to be able to appoint his own cabinet. And that's what has been done. That we saw it in 2009 with Barack Obama. Quite literally fired every ambassador there was and appointed his own. He appointed his own cabinet. He appointed his own advisors. And no one said a word, because that's the way it should be. If the president is to do his job properly, he needs advisors that he can trust to be honest with him, to be there to advise him, to allow him to do the job as best he can. Not who might be there to, in 4 years say, see, he didn't get everything done. Imagine if President Trump had been forced to keep Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who had just run against him. Imagine if, and I don't remember who it was, but imagine if Barack Obama had been forced to keep Secretary of State from George W. Bush, who had just campaigned for McCain-Palin. It just doesn't work. And this is where Andrew Jackson was coming from. He knew that there were certain positions that didn't need to be cleaned out, but there were certain that did. And that's what he was arguing. There were people who called it favoritism, nepotism, cronyism, whatever you want to call it. They have accused them of backroom deals. Jackson actually did have more votes than Clay, if I remember right. Clay led the House to vote for who they saw as being the best choice for president. I don't have any information, any facts, evidence, any anecdotal evidence, any documents, anything at all from the 1820 election or 1824 election or any of these that show a president said, if you'll make sure I win, I'll give you a job. It may have happened at certain points in history, but it doesn't show to have happened here. I don't know what else to say on that. I mean, Jackson had it right. Monroe had it right. Monroe knew we had to take a stance against Europe. Europe was still very much interested in controlling the resources available in the Americas. We were here, though. We were a sovereign nation. We were already expanding west. And any colonization attempts by Europe would be a direct competition for our natural resources and our ability to produce and grow crops, produce textiles and other things to trade with the world. So he took that stance. Jackson knew that you could not have basically American nobility. We had seen where government goes when only the nobility is really in charge. And the Constitution was a first step to addressing that shortfall of government. At first, of course, only white men who owned land could vote. But by 1820, white men could vote. And by later and later and later in time, pardon me, as we move through the history of the U.S., we see the errors of our past corrected. Okay, I'm not going to argue that we should never have waited to grant freedom to all who lived in the U.S. I'm probably as staunch an anti-slavery person as the abolitionists of the 1850s and 60s were. I abhor the concept of slavery. My ancestors fought for the Union to free slaves. My ancestors were poor sharecroppers. We never owned a slave in our history and fought to free them. My mother is an incredibly brilliant woman. My father, a brilliant man. Why should one be allowed to vote and one not? Or why should neither be allowed to vote because my father doesn't own land? And that's how I think. And I think this way because I have the lens of history to look at where America began and how we got to where we are. At that time, social mores were that women were really to be the caretakers, to be in the home, to care for the family. Without that, the family falls apart. Okay, it just cannot work. Social mores today are vastly different. The world has changed. This is no longer the world of when you make shoes, you have someone standing at a counter with hammers and nails and leather and making a pair of shoes by hand, or a hatter doing it by hand, or a person making clothing by hand, growing crops with a mule and a plow. Technology has given us a world where the lines of who is physically able to do what job have changed exponentially and diametrically. And as the country saw that happening, you would see that the mores would change, where slavery would fall away. And it had to be done forcibly, but it was done. Where rights to vote would come, where rights to sit and eat in a diner would come. In my mind, it did take longer than I wish it would have, but it has happened. We no longer have laws where people of a certain race have to go around back to a filthy bathroom and a water spigot that's a foot from the ground, but can walk in and eat in any restaurant they choose to. We still are not a perfect people, and we never will be until the end of secular governance on the planet and the millennial kingdom and ultimately the new heaven and new earth. We're watching right now as we have people who in 2000 cheered Al Gore for suing the government for 37 days over one state, where we know the media calling it meant people in the panhandle didn't vote because they thought it was useless. We have people who cheered Hillary Clinton not conceding until the very final minute when there was no choice in 2016. But now, Donald Trump was to concede on the 3rd or 4th of November because the media called the election. Despite 3 o'clock on 4th November, hundreds of thousands of votes showing up. Despite evidence we now have of Dominion voting machines being so susceptible to corruption that we don't know what happened. Today is November 22nd. It has been 19 days. By the Gore standard, we still have 18 days. And no concession has to be made at all. There is no requirement for that. We're watching a period of history unfold that, quite honestly, is going to be recorded as one of the most tumultuous in American history. And it will be up to us to decide how it is resolved. Whether it is resolved with the country falling to violence, riots, cities burning, or people growing up, growing a spine and saying, okay, fine, I didn't win, I'm going to campaign harder. And that's on us. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, but as always, be civil. We're going to start at the next video, really the run-up to the Civil War. It's going to be a little bit more fast-paced. We're going to be looking at changes in industrialization, changes in agricultural technology, things like that. We already know Eli Whitney's cotton gin was introduced prior to 1800. But, as with any new technology, it was exorbitantly expensive. So people weren't able to use it right away. Probably one, maybe two videos, then get into the Civil War and Reconstruction. From there, it is more leapfrog through history until we get all the way up to 2020, 2021, wherever it is we are when this series ends. Thank you for staying with me and participating. As I said, be civil. We are adults. We can converse, disagree, dissent, and discuss, but do it civilly. Please remember also to like and share the video to affect the algorithm and to make sure we grow the channel. You'll also want to be subscribed because there will be videos off topic and off schedule that will launch as soon as I do them, as opposed to these that launch on Wednesday. You'll want to know about them. Until next time, have a wonderful day.